Thank you. So I want to start by saying thank you to the Sudbury Historical Society for giving me this opportunity, and it's also nice to see so many familiar faces, neighbors, friends, and other Sudbury residents. So let me see. I don't see the presentation on the screen here, but I guess it's okay. So before I get into all the plants, I just wanted to at least give you a little bit of background so I could set the context for the plants. Francisco, I just wanted to ask, do I see the presentation on the screen or only over here? Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, so first of all, a little bit of context. I think everyone here knows that, I can't take Sudbury River through Sudbury as a separate piece. It's all kind of part of a bigger river system. So the Sudbury, Assabet, and Concord rivers are three tributaries of the Merrimack River, and these have their headwaters here in Westboro. So you can see, the Merrimack River comes all the way from New Hampshire, and then eventually it flows into to the sea through in that Plum Island area, and the Sudbury and Assabet join. The confluence is at Egg Rock in Concord, just above Route 2, and then they flow into the Merrimack in Lowell. So I just wanted you to have that kind of picture in your head, because I will touch base a little bit on that headwaters, because we want to know where this river is coming from if we want to protect the river. So another important thing that's also good to know is that maybe Alyssa, you can correct me. So about 19 miles of the river is part of the wild and scenic river system, which is federally designated. So we are very fortunate to be in this particular situation. So one other map, I think Bill Andreas is familiar with this. Once upon a time when there were no maps, we ended up with the Friends group designing a bunch of maps to inform the public. And so this is a map of Sudbury, and you can see, the Sudbury River is the northern part of our town's boundary. I tried to put a few little red triangles there to locate ourselves. So somewhere on Route 27, that's Walback Farm, and the Wayland Golf, the golf course is here somewhere. There is where the boundary of Sudbury is kind of defined by the river. And then you go along Water Row, and it kind of meanders, and this entire river all the way down from Wayland, just below Route 126 near Greenways Conservation Area, is all the Great Meadows National Wildlife Refuge. So I'd say exclusively all the river through Sudbury is within the Great Meadows National Wildlife Refuge. And of course managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then above the north of Sudbury, you can see where I put another little red triangle, a bunch of conservation areas in Lincoln and Concord, which is the Fairhaven Bay and the Wrightwoods and Misery Hill, et cetera. So just to give you some context, as I talk about the river within Sudbury and the plants here, I just thought I will give you this little bit of context. And also the places I've marked are also, for those of you who don't canoe and are not on the water a lot, they're easy places to access the river. So whether you're on Route 20 near Russell's or right near the golf course, I think that old bridge is now closed. I tried going in there recently. And then Sherman's Bridge on Lincoln Road and on 117. So those are kind of good places after I've given you a little orientation to the plant, good places to go, take a look and see how much you recognize. So now a little bit of context about the plants. So the plants along the rivers are adapted to fluctuating water levels. So the technical term we use as botanists is riparian communities. So they're very able to withstand ice scour, flooding during spring. So I'm just putting a few pictures. You know, you get all that melting snow that has a lot of rushing water, and the river will rise during that period. And then, of course, you get the occasional flooding. And then other years when you have droughts or long dry periods, you will get totally exposed tree roots and tree trunks. So you have to have plants that can handle this whole gamut of, you know, changes, and not most plants can't do that. So these plants that grow along rivers tend to be able to handle this kind of fluctuating conditions. And, you know, it's a little bit similar to the desert plants or something sometimes. It's dry, but nights can get very cold or day can get very hot. So some plants in some of these environments need to be able to handle these sharp changes. So this, you know, I'm going to get a tiny bit technical because plants, you know, there's some method to the madness in how they grow along the river. And if you know, get a sense of it, then it's easier when you're out there walking. It's a little bit easier for you to know what to spot where. So usually, as you can see here, there's a river channel where you get aquatic plants, floating plants, and then you get the areas of the floodplain forest where the water overflows onto the river banks. And that area is able to have large trees. So we have these floodplain forests, and in this particular, in the Sudbury River, it's a third order tributary, second and third order. So the water fluctuations are not that high unless, say, you go to Merrimack or Connecticut River, huge rivers where the water fluctuation can be huge. So you get kind of, you know, moderate fluctuation levels. And then these can also extend to red maple swamps. So you get lots of red maple swamps in river unrelated situations also. But these are particular kinds of red maple swamps we call alluvial because there's a lot of sediment from the rivers that get deposited over the, you know, hundreds and thousands of years, and they create particular kinds of plant communities. Then you get tall shrub swamps. And then as you get closer to the water, you get these very grassy environments, lots of cattails and grasses, sedges and rushes, lots of herbaceous plants. And then in this particular Sudbury River, for reasons I will explain later, we also have these huge buttonbush swamps, almost exclusive buttonbush swamps, which is not that original to the river, maybe, you know, because of our human impact. Some of these plants have found it very, how do you say, the habitat is just right for them, so they can be kind of opportunistic. So before I go on to the river in Sudbury, I just want to give a little shout out to the headwaters. As I said, you know, it's important to protect those headwaters. So Atlantic cedar swamps in the Westboro area is where both the Assabet and the Sudbury rivers begin. And, you know, this is pretty typical. I know someone mentioned the Nile just a little while ago. So most rivers tend to start either in these kinds of, you know, spongy, mossy swamps in mountains where, you know, water's kind of bubbling up and everything's very squishy, or you have plants, they will usually start from a lake. So in this case, these are all dominated by Atlantic white cedar. The scientific name is Chimocyparis thioides, and you get lots of red maple, dense layer of shrubs, and of course lots and lots of peat moss. So, you know, that's a little close-up of the Atlantic white cedar. And when you're in the swamp, of course, you can't see the treetops, so that's why I put a little picture on the left so that when you're away from it, you can kind of see those cedars, the tops of the cedars. So one more slide just to give you a little more information about that headwater areas. There's almost 2,200 acres in the Cedar Hill Swamp in this particular area of the 4 boroughs, Northborough, Marlborough, Southborough, and Westborough. And about 1,600 acres in Westborough was one of the earliest, or the first area that was preserved by the Massachusetts DCR as a area of critically environmental concern. And of course now there's some Sudbury Valley Trustees land, Sowing Farm, then town lands, etc. All that, together is about 2,200 areas. Now there's a 4 boroughs loop trail. I highly recommend you go there. It's a fabulous place to explore. Okay, so now I'll really get started in earnest on the plants. So I'll take you down some of the floodplain plants and the red maple swamps. Given time constraints, I didn't want to break down things too much. But there's a lot of kind of silver maple with green ash, Sudbury elm, lots of swamp white oak. I'll show you some close-ups of these plants, and then I like that picture taken by another Sudbury resident who came on my walks of the alluvial red maple swamps. The fall is a great time to spot these red maple stands because the change in color creates such a nice contrast that you can spot from a distance exactly where the river is. So you get lots of dense shrubs and herbaceous plants. And then I'll also throw in the tall shrub swamps. This picture was handy. I did a little workshop for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a few other groups, and so Lin Fu, who was a former head, took a bunch of pictures. So it gives a nice, you can get a sense of scale when I say a tall shrub swamp, so you can see the shrubs are, as tall as me or twice as tall as me. So you get 10 to 12 foot high. Then in areas of open water, you can have grasses, sedges, a bunch of ferns. So this is on the Red Maple Trail in Weir Hill. Okay, so do all of you know silver maple? No? I know we all know sugar maple, and there's red maple. That's becoming more and more common as our oaks and other trees go. Red maple seems to be very versatile. But along the river, silver maple really dominates because it's very adapted to the water. So I have this picture during the winter because it's easy to see the multiple trunks. So even if you're down at Sherman's Bridge, you can see, if you look to the left and the right, you'll see a lot of silver maples with multiple trunks. And they also have this ability when they lose a lot of limbs, and also sometimes the trunks will fall down and then they will sprout. And if you're wondering why a whole bunch of silver maples are growing in a straight row, that's because that one trunk gave rise to maybe six trees that are growing in a row. So they tend to have lots of ferns and herbaceous plants. And then I just have a close-up. Silver maple has a very deeply cut, kind of almost filigreed kind of leaf, and it's very white underside, has an underside. So at a distance you will see this very kind of whitish halo with the silver maples, which you don't see with the other maples. Then the red maple, is another one that grows in these kinds of floodplain forests. So I like this picture because in the spring and the fall, there's a nice contrast. In the spring, the silver maples have very greenish yellow flowers, and the red maples have very deep red flowers. It's almost like a little halo. Almost it's subtle, not as striking as in the fall, but very subtle. And if you're looking for it, you do see that the flowers in early spring. And so it's a nice time in the fall and the spring to see these contrasting colors. Then green ash is another plant that grows in these environments. I think if many of you are familiar with Native American uses in this particular area, green ash is a particular favorite for basket making. I think Robin Wall Kimmerer had quite a chapter in her braiding sweetgrass. So unlike in the black ash, these little stems are much shorter, and these little leaflets actually sit on these divided leaf much more in the green ash than in the black ash. Unfortunately, the bad news is, most ash is dying at the moment, because of this emerald ash borer, and the green ash is no exception. As well as when the tree is weakened, there's also something called the ash dieback, because then it becomes much more susceptible to fungi and bacterial infections. So if you see an ash tree with lots of holes, for anyone interested, I can talk a little bit later. There are, of course, groups who are trying to find resistant strains of ash and trying to reintroduce ash in many places where it's dying. Then the swamp white oak, the Quercus bicolor, which you don't usually see on dry ground. This is a very common along the river edge. It's called bicolor because the leaves, again, just like the silver maple, have two different colors. And I think it has something to do with handling radiation, because they're very exposed on the river's edge. So it's very velvety underneath and also very white. So that's why the scientific name is bicolor, Quercus bicolor. And it has very mossy acorn cups. So everyone here knows a swamp white oak? Yes? Okay, good. Then lots of elms. I know there's just like with the ash, we also have lost our elms, but you do find along the river, sometimes you will find an elm that's pretty large. And so you have two kinds of elms. The slippery elm is more common than the American elm, from what I have seen around here. And the slippery elm is particularly identifiable with this very asymmetrical, irregular kind of bottom part of the leaf, as opposed to the American elm. And it appears to be that the slippery elm may be a little bit more resistant to the Dutch elm disease than the American elm. So from the elm trees you see, they tend to be more of the slippery elm. So I'll show you a few shrubs now that I've showed you floodplain, the three main floodplain trees, 3 or 4. So you'll see lots of dogwoods, silky dogwood. I've just, again, very recognizable one with these red stems. And dogwoods all have these, beautiful kind of white flowers, and they have interesting color contrast with the fruits. And we call it fruit flagging, because they try to flag down the migratory birds, and birds often see these color contrasts, and they also have beautiful fall colors. So there are many, many other dogwoods, gray dogwood, which is also quite common, but the silky dogwood is what I have seen mostly along the Sudbury River. Then the speckled alder, Alnus incarna. There are 2 different kinds of alders. There's also a smooth alder. This one has those little spots along the trunk, and they have those tiny little woody cone-like fruits, which the birds love. They're a little bit like the birch fruits, and again has a beautiful pleated leaf. A nice hardy plant if you even want to use it for landscaping. Then high bush blueberry, of course, loves this kind of wet environment. Vaccinium corymbosum has gorgeous red color. I often say this is a great substitute for burning bush. But it does prefer wet feet, but but you do get plenty of cultivars that do like drier ground. And then another related plant called the maleberry, Leonia ligustrina, also related, and they're all in the rhododendron family. Very different kinds of flowers, squat little jar-like flowers as opposed to the blueberry has more like, longer flowers with these little scallops because they have 5 petals. And the maleberry has much more rounded jar-like flowers. And it's also interesting, very different to the blueberry. The maleberry fruits tend to dry on the stem, and they will, have these dry, split fruits, which make it a bit easier to recognize. Oops, I went one more. So one more shrub, familiar one, the northern spice bush, Lindera benzoin, has these beautiful little delicate yellow flowers, another substitute for forsythia, I say. Much better for the environment and the wildlife. And just like with winterberry, the spice bush also has male and female bushes separate. So the male shrub tends to have a lot more tiny flowers, and the female one has less. And if you want to have those red fruits in the summer, then you want to make sure you have a female shrub. And I think the fall color is also gorgeous. And if any of you have smelled a spice bush stem, it has a very benzoin kind of smell. And it actually belongs to the same family as sassafras and cinnamon. So they all have these essential oils, mostly to protect itself from herbivores, but then in each case you get particular insects that will specialize and develop resistance. So the spice bush is the host plant for the spice bush butterfly caterpillar. I'm not good at, okay. So as you get closer to the water, so these are few of the herbaceous plants you see. So these are 2 in the carrot family. They're similar to the Queen Anne's lace, so you will recognize them. We call it umbelliferae because it looks like spokes of an umbrella, and then they'll redivide and have these very tiny flowers. So this is the water hemlock. That one's the water parsnip. This one's flowering right now in Weir Hill, off that little wooden platform. Very pretty, but many of them are also poisonous. So, in this particular family, you want to be careful when you're handling these plants because some of them can be quite poisonous. Any questions? No, you're happy for me to...
How do you tell those 2 apart? How do you tell those 2 apart when you see them out on the
this one tends to have, the flowers are much larger and have many more inflorescences in one plant, whereas this one tends to have single ones. And then this leaf is only divided once, and in the case of the water parsnip, they're divided multiple times. So they're divided once, and then they're redivided. Does that make sense? Yeah. Swamp candles, another beautiful plant, which is a great favorite of mine. I have a little close-up. I have a close-up of that single flower. So that it has 5 petals, and each petal has these beautiful red dots at the bottom, which when you see it at a distance, it just looks like a red circle. But actually, when you look at it very close, they're 2 separate little dots. And sometimes I find, I know mostly bird watchers use binoculars, but in this kind of environment, it's hard to get close to the plants, and I sometimes find a pair of binoculars very helpful If you're seeing a patch of yellow at a distance, then you can really zoom in and see these flowers close up. Then nodding bedded ticks, I mean, there's lots of different types of Bidon species in these kinds of floodplain environments. I think I've seen huge amounts of these in maybe more in Great Meadows, Concord, and sometimes even at Greenways in Wayland, where you can actually get into the floodplain in Sudbury. In the Sudbury area, it's a little bit hard to get. There's not much access. So just fields of these yellow flowers, and they are, unlike most plants in the aster family, sunflower family, which get wind dispersed, so they all become fluffy and like dandelions blow away in the wind. These are animal dispersed, so you get these little seeds with these two little burrs that attach to animal fur and feathers. They're hitchhikers, so that's why I think they're called beggar ticks, because they kind of beg a ride like ticks. So it's I don't know, has many people here seen the Bidons? Yeah, so I've got two hands. So watch out for them. They don't flower profusely every year. Again, many of these plants depend very much on the weather in a particular year. It's just got to be wet enough and not too dry enough, and then you'll have an explosion of them every few years. So this is the swamp milkweed, relative of the common milkweed, the only one that kind of likes to grow near water, because we have a bunch of other milkweeds and they all like dry, sandy, different kinds of habitats. But this one, I think, is the most beautiful of the milkweeds. It's just got such a gorgeous pink. But there's also a white variety. I've seen it at Weir Hill, very pale and almost white. And it obviously is a host plant to the monarch butterfly caterpillar. Then lots and lots of ferns. I think the royal fern is probably the most striking if you're, in early spring, if you're driving down Water Row and these fertile spikes are coming up, you can just see huge areas with the royal fern, and they're also all just very filigreed, all redivided kind of little pinnules. And then up on the right is the cinnamon fern, Osmandastrum cinnamomum, again very striking, also now quite popular for landscaping. And then lots of sensitive fern. And then one shout out for the marsh fern, which, maybe if you're not trained your eye, I know there are a few people here who took my fern class recently. So it looks very much like a hay-scented fern. But hay-scented fern tends to, like woodsy places and drier ground. And they have very parallel pinnules on either side. They're almost like straight. And this fern is the only documented food plant in New England for the marsh fern moth, the Fegitana litaria. So sometimes we don't give too much importance to some of these plants, but you will find they have very exclusive relationships. So let me look at the time. Yeah. Is this time correct?
7:03.
Yeah. So a few more shrubs. So I'm moving closer to the tall shrub swamp. So I want to show you a few additional shrubs because I showed you dogwoods, but viburnums are also equally important, and they like slightly drier ground than the dogwoods. So this is again one of my favorites, the arrowwood. I think it's called arrowwood because Native Americans use the wood because they're very straight. They use them for arrows. Maybe Bill, is that correct? Okay. And again, they also show, just like the dogwoods, they show these color contrasts in fruits. The stems can be very different to the color of the fruit. And the fall colors very contrasting with the fruits. And again, this is for fruit flagging of birds and fall small mammals to be able to get their fruit seeds dispersed. And the scientific name refers to this very toothed margin of the leaf, which is, that is why it's called dentatum, like teeth-like. Virginia rose, one of my favorites. I took this picture somewhere near Sherman's Bridge. It's always hard to know where to park the car. Every place is so narrow. That's the problem with looking up these plants, you know. I can show you lots of plants, but then trying to slow down your car, get off anywhere is a challenge. So right now, of course, the roses are gone. They bloomed early June, but you'll still see plenty of rose hips. Very attractive, and of course, if the birds and the small mammals haven't eaten them all, you'll probably still be able to recognize the rose bushes with those rose hips. Another rose family plant, so you'll see these tiny, tiny little flowers of the white meadowsweet. And there's another one that I don't see much here, which is a darker pink. It's called steeplebush, another spirea species. So you'll see, you know, if you look at these tiny individual flowers, they're actually little rose flowers, or you'll see apple flowers, or, but they're all nicely packed in these little inflorescences. Okay, now we are going to get to the vine planet, because, you know, as you get closer to the water, these places are exposed with a lot of light. So vines love river edges. It's one of their favorite places. So if anyone's walked, you know, in any of these river green areas, you'll see lots and lots of greenbrier. Here's a briar patch, so of course they're great for wildlife. You have lots of birds that nest, and lots of small mammals find protection even in the winter because of all the thorns, because they kind of get all matted. So sometimes you'll see them, you know, about 20 feet high, all climbing, but all matted together. Remember Brer Rabbit and the briar patch? So, you know, so this is just the best example. So they're great for wildlife. And they also tend to have male and female vines. So I have a few flowers here and some fruits. And we don't have too many species. We have some herbaceous ones. But this one, the round leaf or the common greenbrier, is the one that's most visible around here. Sometimes people will ask me, like, you know, is it invasive? But it's not invasive. It's a native plant. And of course, we've created the habitat for it to also just proliferate. Then fox grape, which you'll see lots of grape species. As you can see, this is one of my favorites, so I have two pictures. In the spring, I love the little white, pink, velvety leaves. They almost look like little flowers or birds at a distance. And, you know, grapes also have male and female vines separate. So if you want fruits, you've got to plant at least one female fruit, so that, and they can be very prolific in terms of fruit production, and these are some of the most important plants for fall migratory birds, because they're very high in sugar and they fruit very late into the fall. And so you have lots of hibernating animals and migrating birds that will gorge on these fruits. I think about 80 bird species have been documented as consuming these grapes in the fall. So Vitis labrusca, and there are many other grapes. So this one, the riverbank grape, is the other one that's commonly here. I've seen the summer grape also, but maybe not as often. I'm sorry, this picture seems to have a problem. It decided to turn the other way. But you can see how different it is. You know, it's much green and has a very dentate edge, as opposed to the foxgrape, which is kind of very whitish underneath. Can you see this, the back of the leaf? And it's not that toothed along the edge. Okay, moving along. I've got a few herbaceous vines. So what I showed you were mostly woody vines. I think Stephen here, who canoes a lot, you probably see this one a lot because this tends to be more on the river banks facing the river. So if you're walking on the hiking trails on the land side, you don't really see the hemp vine much. It's in the sunflower family, the only vine in the sunflower family. Has these tiny little white flowers which are almost like boneset, or some of those late fall flowering plants. So again, it's a beautiful sight when you see a huge cascading vine with lots and lots of flowers. The virgin's bower, Clematis virginiana, which is just about to flower now, so that's also another one that likes damp places, maybe not exclusive to the river environment, but you do see a lot of it. And then once it goes to seed, you get these fuzzy balls of little fruits that have flagella, and then sometimes right through the winter you'll be able to identify them because all the leaves have gone off, and you'll have these little fuzzy balls somewhere on the vegetation, and you know that there's a virgin's bower growing there. Okay, so I finished with the floodplains and the what else? The red maple swamps and the tall shrub swamps. So I just want to now move closer to the water, and these are the next two types of areas I want to show is the buttonbush swamplands, which is probably the most extensive type of plant along the Sudbury River, almost pure stands. If I'm sure many of you have been on this wooden lookout at Weir Hill, and so that's a good view in the winter. Whereas far as your eye can see, you see kind of leafless button bushes. This year they were rather late to leaf out because of all the water. And that's a close-up of the buttonbush. So it's called Cephalanthus occidentalis. Cephalanthus meaning because it's like a head. It's circular, so it's filled with tiny, tiny little flowers with all their stamens kind of sticking out. And eventually, when it's fertilized and pollinated, it produces these reddish fruits and little seeds with the ducks and the waterfowl love to eat. So that's how they get spread. And of course, the occidentalis always is interesting because, when scientific names of plants were invented, they were all done in Europe, so they're very Eurocentric. So anything west was occidentalis and anything east was orientalis. So that's how this plant ended up with the name. And it's interesting also that it belongs to the coffee family. We have very few plants here. Just two, the Michella repens, the partridge berry, the buttonbush, and the rest are all bedstraws. So it's fairly poorly represented group of plants in this part of the world. And if you look at them, you'll find very opposite leaves and these beautiful circular flowers. Okay, so I just thought I'll show you a picture just because since I had it so you could see some of these plants in situ instead of in separate pictures. So you see a lot of foxgrape growing here, a bunch of royal fern. I see some sedges, some cattails. So if you're really kind of getting into the swamp, this was a fairly dry year, so it was possible to get in here. Otherwise, there is a few feet of water, or at least too muddy to kind of go in. So you get a sense of scale. Okay, now we are almost at the river, getting closest to the water. So we started from the floodplain forests, the alluvial red maple swamps, and then we went to the tall shrubs and the short shrubs, and now we've got very close to the water where most trees other than some willows are able to grow. So this area tends to have water, right through the year, mostly herbaceous and mostly grass-like plants. I thought this would be the right moment to, to make a reference to how important this particular area of the river was to Native Americans. So of course, Weir Hill was called Weir Hill because there was an area where the river was narrow and these fishing weirs were set up. And many, I'm sure Bill or someone can comment later, but these rivers were called Musquetaquid because they were grassy banks. So there was lots of early settlers, when they described these areas, talked about lots of grassy plants. And I think you were mentioning, Bill, earlier also that along Water Row, most of this grass was, hay was mowed, right? Was very valued, but then eventually I think they got replaced with European grasses, and I'll show you some pictures. So the Native Americans kind of maintained these grassy areas with some low-grade burning. So I want to show you some plants as well as point to the previous button bushes I showed you, because as more and more land was cleared for agriculture, and now with urban habitat and suburbia spreading, all the silt and the erosion is making it very great habitat for buttonbush. So the buttonbush is kind of a native which is very opportunistic and has expanded to lots of areas where you would have had this kind of grassy vegetation. So the only kinds of trees you see in these grassy areas is, in that very first picture I had on the cover of when I started the lecture, were these willows. So you get black willows, pussy willows, which seem to love growing in the water. Then of course you get a lot of what we call graminides and monocots, so like the common arrowhead, Sagittaria latifolia, burreed, sparganium. There are many different species. I think we have about 2 or 3 in this area. They have these very prickly burrs, again, meant to be dispersed by waterfowl, so they get attached to feathers and fur. And then same family are the cattails, broad-leaved cattail, which is the native cattail. The non-native tends to kind of grow more in brackish water, so we don't get much of it here. So this was, of course, possibly the most dominant plant in this vegetation, but now the buttonbush has become the most important. And of course, you always associate cattails with the red-winged blackbird, which loves to nest there. Lots of rushes, like the common soft rush, which is evergreen, so sometimes you'll see it right through the winter. Woolgrass, one of my favorite, very beautiful. Scirpus cyperinus, very tall, very elegant. Lots of tussock sedges. When you think you're walking on firm ground and you're going like this on a marsh, you're on the tussock sedge. This one is particularly prolific. The arrowleaf tear thumb, it's a kind of smartweed. There are 2 or 3 different kinds, but so this is one of them you'll see like bright green edges along the river. Most of it is this smartweed or tear thumb. Then marsh bedstraws. And I'll give a little shout out to the plants of the birds and the animals in these habitats. So those particular grassy edges are really important as primary nesting habitat for lots of rare birds. And they support many frogs, salamanders, especially leopard frogs, pickerel, green bullfrogs, some vernal pool obligate species such as wood frogs and salamanders. So I'll end with a little bit of not so bad news, but anyway, I do have to talk a little bit about our impact on the rivers. I didn't want to get too sidetracked at the beginning. So, every part of the river has been altered during the colonial period and from the 1600s to the 1950s. So there's a lot of dams, clearing for farms. The Concord River particularly has a dam in Billerica, which kind of impacts the Sudbury River all the way northwards. Then maybe lots of people know about the pollution and the Nyanza textile factory, which was in Ashland. And then, of course, there's a lot of reservoirs in the Framingham area that provided drinking water to Boston. So all this damming and altering the river obviously has had an impact on the plants. So many introduced plants have become invasive. So I'll give you a quick look at some of these. So of course everyone maybe recognizes these because these are some of our commonest plants. The glossy false buckthorn, the Morrow's honeysuckle, the Japanese barberry, and then some of these herbaceous plants like the forget-me-not and the moneywort, Lysimachia. I'm guilty of it too. When I first moved to Sudbury, I planted these in my garden. Now I can't get rid of them. So, and then the common reed, the Phragmites australis, which, if you're on Route 20 in that Russell's area, you just see huge, tall banks of these. And then the reed canary grass, I understood, was introduced by during colonial times, and I don't know whether they were more palatable to the cattle that were brought or what the reason is, but now it seems to have kind of taken over. Purple loosestrife, very pretty. This year there's been a particular explosion of them for whatever reason, and they used to be very close to the water, but they seem to be now spreading more towards drier ground. And the requirements for growth are very similar to cattails. So this particular plant has been quite bad for the cattails because it's replacing it. Oh, I didn't want to end on invasive plants, so I thought I had to have a pretty picture, and I know there's lots of people here who can maybe answer some questions too, in the sense that of course we're lucky that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has protected most of the Sudbury River in Sudbury and the floodplain and the Great Meadows National Wildlife Refuge, and so that's kind of what you're seeing here. I think this is somewhere near Herd Pond in Wayland, and that may be Route 20. And that's, and I think all these brown areas are the buttonbush swamps on either side of the river. So, there's a lot we can contribute. There are many nonprofits like the Suasco River Stewardship Council, the Friends of the Refuges, the ORS. So, I hope people can get involved and pitch in and keep restoring the river. So thank you, and